Welcome to the Soundtrap Education Summit, a free online event dedicated to empowering and amplifying student voice with the theme, Their Voice, Their World. We're bringing you inspiring and practical messages from musicians, educators, podcasters, students, and more that can help you make change in your classroom right away. I'm Matt Miller, author of Ditch That Textbook and the moderator of the summit. Our sponsor and host of the summit is Soundtrap, a collaborative and creative audio editing platform. Soundtrap for Education empowers students and teachers to explore creative sound recording in all subjects, for all ages, and all ability levels. And you can sign up for their free online course to learn how to bring music and podcasting to your classroom at academy.soundtrap.com. And in this session today, it's going to be all about storytelling, which is a pretty cool topic, I think, because storytelling fits really into just about everything that we do. And so we're going to mesh this together with a variety of things, including identity, which, for kids of all ages, all the way up through college and, even as adult kids, identity is kind of a big deal. And it's something that we're all trying to figure out. And so that's why we have our guests, Micaela Blei and Onnesha Roychoudhuri, with us today to talk about that particular topic. So welcome to both of you, and thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's do some introductions real quick. Micaela, I want to kick it over to you first. Can you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Micaela Blei. I'm an educator, a storyteller, a story editor, and a sort of a consultant of narrative these days. But I'm also a teacher educator. So I was a classroom teacher for several years in elementary school. And then I developed and ran the education program for The Moth, which is the nonprofit storytelling organization. And I developed their curriculum and sort of trained people in that, in storytelling, true personal narrative storytelling for many years. And now I work in a really wide range of contexts around story, how we tell our stories, and what we do with it. And then the side note to that is I have my doctorate in education with a focus on storytelling and identity. So I studied how storytelling can both express and constitute identity for teachers.
Wow.
So that's like a big mess of stuff that I'm about, but the through line is sort of, how do we tell our stories?
Yes, exactly. And I love all of the focus on education on that too. And she was, Micaela was too modest to mention that you were the Grand Slam winner twice for the Moth storytelling. Tell me what the name of that was again.
Yeah, so I'm a two-time Moth Grand Slam champion. So the Moth has competitive storytelling nights, story slams, and if you win one of those, you go to a championship. I didn't play sports in high school, so this was like my sport. This is I like to say I lettered in storytelling, basically.
Nice.
And yeah, so that's the other thing I do.
Yeah, excellent, very good. Okay, Onnesha, on to you. Who you are and what you do.
Yes, so I have a background in journalism and writing as well as storytelling. So I kind of come to the table with this focus on storytelling in different mediums. So I actually met Micaela because I was teaching with her in high school, teaching storytelling in schools in New York City. And then in terms of my background in journalism and writing, I also teach at the graduate level, and the sort of common thread through this work, and then also working as a consultant with different nonprofits and social justice organizations on like framing and narrative. Like my core obsession is storytelling, is how we choose to articulate what our goals and identities are. And I feel like what draws me to that work is that I feel like being able to tell an authentic and compelling story actually directly impacts what we believe and are able to make possible. And so as an author, I published a book called The Marginalized Majority, Claiming Our Power in a Post-Truth America. And that's actually all about narratives and stories that we tell ourselves around activism, around protest, around received narratives related to what is possible And yeah, so that's a little bit about what I do.
Excellent. Very good. Very good. I'm really excited about this because I know that for me personally, I've believed for a long time that storytelling shows up everywhere. It shows up in our personal lives. It definitely shows up in schools and classrooms, I think sometimes whether we realize it or not. And so I wanted to give the both of you an opportunity to kind of debunk this belief that I think a lot of educators have, that, the power of storytelling and, some of the storytelling techniques and strategies that we can use. I think they might say, I teach math. Grade doesn't really come into that. I teach second grade. We read stories, but I don't think that storytelling really plays in. And, I've got to believe that there are lots of ways to debunk that. And so I wondered if the both of you wanted to kind of take that from your own different directions. And so Micaela, why don't I just kick it over to you and let us know what you think about that?
Yeah, I think that so first of all, I'll start by saying sometimes it's not time for a story. I'm not one of these people, when you're a carpenter, everything looks like a nail, right? You want to say that story is the solution to all of it. And that's not necessarily true. That's real. But I think that the way that we understand the world, for better or worse, is in a narrative way. And the way that we understand ourselves is often in a narrative way. And so to the math teacher, I say, you're actually telling stories all the time. Every time you do project-based math, and every time you do story problems, and every time you're trying to construct and help people understand the stakes of why they want to understand what they want to understand. That's number one. Number two, I think that there's something really valuable about, as a performer, one of the reasons why I was so drawn to storytelling versus acting, for example, versus being a character, is that authentic connection. The way that I approach storytelling, and I think Onnesha and I share this, that at its core is authentic connection to other people. That being seen, letting yourself be seen, and seeing others within boundaries and in ways that you are comfortable and feel in control of, can actually put you in the room more directly and more vitally than if you were just learning abstract concepts. This is not new for pedagogy, right? This is not a new idea, but storytelling is this really direct line to that. Storytelling is a really direct line to being in the room together. Whether students are telling their own stories, or they're hearing the personal stories of others, or they're hearing the personal connections to the curriculum that teachers have, those are all ways that we get put into the same place, whether a physical room or a Zoom room, I should say. So I think that in that way, storytelling ends up being everywhere, even if it's not, I get up and tell a story, those connections exist.
Right. See, this is why I'm so glad that we've got the both of you here, and why this, I think, fits so well in the general concept of this summit. Is that, really storytelling fits in so many different places, and if we can kind of see it, and if we doubt that and we see it in a different lens, then it kind of changes everything. So Onnesha, do you want to give us your quick take on the idea that maybe storytelling doesn't fit everywhere, doesn't fit in education, so on and so forth?
Yeah, well, I mean, my first impulse, first of all, one of the thoughts I had, because you used the specific example of math, for me personally, I remember I was taking calculus and physics from the same professor back in high school. And I was doing quite well in the physics class, and I was just bombing calculus. And he was like, what? I don't understand. It's the same math. And I was like, well, right, but one is in context. One has a story, one has a situation. And obviously there are different learning styles. And for me, I am a really narratively word-based person and learner and communicator. But I think beyond that, like, the reality is, if we broaden, I feel like story has certain associations, right? It's like a discrete story. I'm telling the story, there's beginning, middle, and end. But like story, when you think about it in terms of narrative, that's, as Micaela was saying, that's literally how we navigate the world. And for me, as someone who's very interested in our understanding of history, and by looking at the stories that are available to us or not available to us in history, how that informs our sense of who we are now and what's possible. To me, story and narrative have a really vital role in every subject that a teacher might discuss, because so much of it is about context. So much of it is about, how do we come to this point? How are we understanding what we're engaging with right now? I think that that's like this really rich space that we don't always come to, especially if we're just sort of teaching towards the test or, you know, have really concrete goals. But just context and situation, which I think everyone, but especially younger kids, are so hungry for. It's like, well, but why? Why are we engaging with this? What is the purpose of this? What does it mean? And I think that's where narrative and story is really compelling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I totally agree.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start to kind of focus this a little bit. You know, that we've talked generally about story. Let's kind of go in on this idea of using storytelling within. We were talking about context earlier, within the context of identity, which I know is super important to the both of you. And as we were mentioning earlier, you know, especially in, you know, the K-12 higher education environment, you know, so many students, whether, you know, from the littles to the bigs, as I like to say, you know, they're all forming their identity. I mean, I've got a kid in high school and I still feel like I'm forming my own identity. You know, it's still,
Totally.
it's still happening. Right. And this can be a big part. This is one of the things that fascinates me about this topic is that I guess telling the stories and hearing stories can have a big impact on that. And so, yeah, Micaela, go ahead.
It doesn't just have an impact. This is what I love about it too, Matt, is that it doesn't just have an impact. It is making identity. So one of the things that I appreciate so much about telling a personal story about my life, especially telling it to someone else, not just saying it in the mirror, but like being in community with someone and sharing something, I'm not only expressing or explaining something that is preformed that I have decided, I am learning by saying. I mean, it's embodied knowledge, right? It's embodied learning. And I'm making sense of my world and making sense of myself by telling the story. One of the things that we hear so much from high school students, especially as they're telling stories for the first time, is I didn't realize how it was going to come out until I said it, and then it made more sense. So it makes more sense in the telling. And so one of the ways that I can see storytelling and identity being so crucially linked is that it's not just an expression of it; it's a tool for it, which makes it really important for those developing minds.
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. Onnesha, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually what has motivated Micaela and I to continue collaborating and teaching workshops together, is that we really share this understanding of the power and also attendant like pitfalls, right? Like that if storytelling is constructing identity, then the space that you create for it becomes critical, right? How you because to me, I'm also especially interested in you know, I remember I moved to the South when I was 10 years old and, you know, moved to an area that was fairly progressive, but still predominantly Black and white. There wasn't a whole lot of in between. And as someone who's half Indian, half white, you know, there was this very tense and like unknown space that I was inhabiting, where it was kind of like, I was supposed to choose a side. I was supposed to fit somewhere. And I think the ways in which we create or don't create space for people of various ages, but especially in that K-12 space, to construct their identity, to explain themselves. Like in that setting, I felt this pressure to respond to the environment I was in, right? I had to make myself fit. So I think when I think about creating spaces for storytelling and identity, it's about how can we create a space in which students feel more freedom and latitude to both own their own story, construct their own story, but also in as much as is possible, reduce some of those barriers to feeling as though you have to respond to preconceived expectations or notions of where you need to file who you are.
Yes. And I think, and to add on to that, I think one of the things that we do that I really appreciate that we've sort of kept doing is de-emphasizing the authority of who knows what a good story is. Very practically speaking, one of the ways that you can create that space in your classroom is by allowing an emergent idea of what is a good story. That if there's a rubric that is a teacher preconceived rubric of like, it has to have this, it has to do this, it has to do this, those are useful and helpful in lots of ways. But if that's the be all end all, if that's a closed system, then students are going to feel that they have to land somewhere, definitive. And that's going to really support that black and white, that sort of like, I gotta put myself in a box feeling that Onnesha is talking about. But if the purpose of a story is to be best understood, then the class is a person's classmates, a person's colleagues, a person's fellow listeners are going to be the ones who can say whether that was best understood. Whether it's objectively a good story or not is less interesting to me than, is this a story that gets across what you want it to get across? And putting the emphasis on that allows for a person to say, this is what I want to try to say, and I can try this out. And it might not be what I wanted to say after all. I can change, right? Mm-hmm. I don't have to like have a version locked. There's all kinds of ways that we can push that power back onto a class, the class itself, the students themselves, so that there is space for this kind of exploration.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that.
Sure.
So yeah, it's all about that autonomy, right? And then building that into the classroom space. And I feel like Micaela and I do that in a few different concrete ways. And one is we usually always open with like some sort of community agreement so that everyone who's in that space can contribute like what they feel we need in that space to feel comfortable sharing a personal story. And we also ask, what makes a good story to your mind and in your experience, right? And that's really lovely because it allows into the room, students, they'll often cite like a family member or a grandmother or grandfather, and it brings that, because the notion is that like storytelling has been around since humans have been around, right? And so it allows into the room the fact that like we all are already authorities in differing ways when it comes to story. And so by bringing all of that expertise that's already in the room to the table, I think it's a great starting off point for people to be like, oh, right, I know what a strong story is. Like now let's try it out. Now let's develop some tools and bring that to this already pre-existing wisdom and knowledge that everyone already has.
Mm-hmm. And the third thing we do to continue that list, those first two are huge. And then the third one is after a student tells, and we're of course, we should have said at the very top, we're talking about personal stories from people's experience, from their life experience. When someone is done telling a story, part of protocol is asking that storyteller, how was that? So instead of launching right into here's how you could make that better, or here's what I thought of your story, the first question is, what did you think of your story? And what are you looking for to either improve or get feedback on? So that mm-hmm. they get to choose. They get to say, actually, I'm not changing anything. I love it the way it is, but I want to know about my performance. Or they could say, actually, I don't need any advice on my performance, but I'm interested in if it really came across how sweet my boyfriend was being at the time. Like, did you really get that feeling? And like, can we work on that together? So that they get that control.
It's really building that muscle of consent and autonomy at every turn, so like we also emphasize that if at any point, as you're trying out a story, because again, like as Micaela was saying, we want this to be a space where people don't have to feel this heavy weight of like, what happens if I fail, right? Like there's no failing in trying out a story. And so creating that space and allowing students, it's like, okay, if you, as you start telling a story, you realize like, actually, no, this isn't, never mind. I'm going to stop right now. That's not where I want to go. Let me try something else, and when you set up those expectations from the start, I think it creates this space where people feel, like much more in control of the experience, and less, especially I think when you're dealing with, like middle school, high school, of course, there's this deep pressure of thinking about, how are my peers going to hear this? How are they going to respond to this? So if you're creating those spaces consciously, where it's like this story belongs to this person and they control it at every turn, hopefully you can help create, as comfortable a space as is possible for more open-ended sharing and trying things out.
Yeah. I love this. I feel like we're getting to sit in on this like amazing storytelling masterclass. This is like, I mean, you just keep bouncing things back and forth. I'm happy to just sit back and listen when it comes to this because I'm already learning so much. I just want to go back and say, Micaela, when you added that third piece to the autonomy list that we were kind of making together, where you said, ask the storyteller, how was that? See, I love that because it feels to me, as someone who, speaks to audiences of teachers sometimes, or, who records videos or does whatever, sometimes I feel like I've got to nail it on the first try. And there's a lot of pressure in that,
Totally.
And so getting the opportunity to go back and talk about the experience and what I liked about it and what I didn't like about it, because each, in my case, each speech is a different organism and it all comes out differently, even if I'm running off of the same script, but I think this also allows us to do the metacognitive practice of going back over what we've just done and analyzing it as a learner, which is so important, all the way across the K-12 spectrum into higher education, no matter what you teach, that's one of those metacognitive practices. And I love having that built into storytelling. That's fantastic.
And there's two pieces to it, actually. There's the metacognition, and there's this growing self-efficacy, which also is incredibly important, right? That's a huge marker for success. And to know, I already know how to do this. And so I tell stories. I know how to do that. One of the things that I started developing, I think I might have coined this phrase, and I'm not totally sure, but I'm pretty sure I did. I can't find it, but it's in my dissertation, so you can cite me, I think, like Blei 2018. This idea of social drafting, which is that's the phrase that I think I invented, and I apologize to whoever I stole.
We'll give it to you today, at least.
Yeah. For today, it's mine. So social drafting is the idea of how we tell stories in life. And we all have stories that we know kind of work and we end up telling a few times. Like the first time we tell it, I mean, actually I use Onnesha as an example whenever I'm explaining this. When I first tell a story, I'm often talking to Onnesha on the phone. I mean, we're not only colleagues, we're really good friends. And I'll just like tell her the whole thing. I'll tell her everything that happened, including what I wore and some gossip that I heard on the way, right? I'll just put it all in. And then later, so let's say it's like a crazy thing that happened to me on the train. And then later I'm at a dinner party and someone brings up like crazy train stories. And I think, oh, I have one. And this time I trim it. I don't do the boring parts. I know Onnesha will listen to my boring parts, but I'm at a dinner party. So now I'm just doing the parts that I remember she laughed at, and I'm kind of skipping over the parts that I know aren't relevant. So I'm doing this very sophisticated editing work as a human. This is very sophisticated editing. And it's something that I already know how to do, whether or not I've taken a writing class. And so to point that out to students and participants of any kind, to point that out to new storytellers, can sometimes be that light bulb moment of, oh, I see. I don't have to take in a whole bunch of new techniques and information. I have to draw myself out and find my confidence, but I already can do this. And that's something that I find really magical about it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as someone whose wheelhouse is more writing, I do a lot of storytelling now, but it's definitely my first language is more writing. And to do social drafting, to try out a story without having written it out word for word, was really intimidating for me initially. But I so came to appreciate what happens when you do that, because like echoing what Micaela is saying, I think it's tapping into a much more instinctual sensibility that we all have. And as you are telling in the act, you are often just gathering so much information, recognizing, oh, what's important, what's not important. So even as a writer, I often incorporate when I'm leading writing workshops, I often incorporate storytelling exercises because I feel like it's a really powerful editing tool. But I also wanted to quickly just circle back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of, how is that to tell? Like the other thing that I really like about that is that it opens up the space for embodiment and like checking in with yourself in spaces that we aren't very often encouraged to do so, I don't think. So often when we ask that question, how is that to tell? I've been blown away by people's responses. So many times you'll have a storyteller who seems super confident, like it was the easiest thing for them to tell this story. And when you ask them, how is that to tell? They might say, that was so hard and it was really emotional. And I'm not I'm not sure how I feel about it yet. And I don't know. And that does two things, right? It creates a space so that people can check in with themselves and really ground themselves in how they're actually feeling. But it also, by sharing that with the group, and we're all there to, support them and provide feedback, it's teaching us as listeners how to be there for that storyteller, right? Like, we're going to shape our feedback, we're going to shape our support and our response to some extent, how, like, the experience that they're having.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's fantastic. Oh my goodness. Okay, so we could continue going on and on and on with this, I feel like, and I would absolutely adore getting to do that.
Same.
We've right, but we've already spent half of our time kind of setting this up, which is fantastic. I think everything that we've covered so far is spot on when it comes to storytelling. But I've been dying to get around to this next very practical question, which I think comes naturally after the conversation we've had so far. And that is, especially since the both of you have experience in education in a variety of different ways, the big question that I think we have to come around to is, how can this show up in an educational setting? What could it look like? Like, can we give, if we've spent the first 20 minutes of this interview convincing someone who's watching this of the importance of storytelling, if they weren't already convinced before, let's spend the rest of it giving them some how, or giving them some tips, or giving them some ideas on how this might show up in an educational setting. So who wants to take that first?
I can start. And then I'll throw it over. I think that the number one thing that I want teachers to know about doing personal storytelling in the classroom is, okay, I have 1 and 2. Number one is, there is no one size fits all. There is no, either you do it 100% or you're not doing it at all. There is such a range of ways that you can be using these tools, these concepts, these philosophies in your classroom, in your education spaces, in ways that will allow people to start to understand their own boundaries, start to connect with one another, like do all of these wonderful things. And develop editing tools and speaking and listening skills. So, for example, the idea of standing up and sharing a 5-minute personal story without notes is way past what a lot of teachers feel comfortable doing in their classrooms. And I don't want that to mean they don't do any of this. So you can listen to lots of stories. You can find stories online and listen together to them. You can use sort of small brainstorming prompts that allow people to share just a little bit with each other as ways to community build before doing something else. You can use principles of storytelling and apply them to historical figures so that people start seeing the human side of history, right? There's so many ways to do this, and I really advocate not being precious about it at all. I really advocate not being like, well, but they have to XYZ. The other thing that I want educators to know, especially because a lot of the storytelling shows out there, Risk and The Moth and Story Collider, are these those personal storytelling shows are these very high stakes. They often curate the most high stakes, intense, dramatic stories. And it can be dangerous because we listen to those and think, oh, that's what the stories should sound like. And so I should get my students telling their most personal stories, their deepest stories, the stories they wouldn't otherwise tell, because that's what I'm hearing on the radio. And we can sometimes accidentally or unconsciously equate those objectively high stakes stories with high story quality. So when I was education director at The Moth, I would sometimes get these requests for help that were like, my students are telling great stories, but they're really light. Like, they won't get personal with me. And how can I make them get personal with me? And that question is a big flag, right? How can I make them get personal with me? No, what's central to me is how do I make a space where they want to do what they want to do? If what they want to do is tell stories about lemonade stands, that's where they're at. And I really support us as educators really trying to see our students and what they're able to do so that they feel comfortable. Maybe they don't tell those stories until 10 years down the line, if ever. So those are two things to think about: the scale at which you can do it, and the ways that we can start to rethink what makes a good story for ourselves, so that we're ready to show up authentically with students the way that they need us to.
Yeah, yeah. And Micaela, I was reading on your website something that I thought sums this up so perfectly in just a few words. It says the thing is there's no perfect way to tell a story, there's your way. And I think you alluded to that earlier, and I thought that's perfect. And just like you were saying earlier, they don't have to be, if you see, on a video or something, if you see someone telling this like deep, painful, maybe traumatic, or maybe just emotional or whatever story, that's not the only thing. And that's not the only way to express these personal stories, right?
Agreed. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Onnesha, what about you? As far as ways that, again, trying to turn the conversation towards how does this show up in an educational setting?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously have a very similar philosophy to Micaela, and one of the things that I enjoy doing is just incorporating aspects of storytelling into workshops that I lead in various ways. So like one of the things that I love to do when I'm teaching, especially like in the first meeting that I'm having with people, is to actually use like sharing a personal story and understanding to like my goal is twofold in like bringing storytelling into like a first day workshop or class, and it's to like I'll often have people share around the topic of the class, right? So if we're just using like math, since we were talking about that earlier, like if I were to lead a workshop that was on calculus, for instance, the way my brain works, the way that I tend to do this is like I want to bring people into the room authentically. I want them to bring their full selves, or more of their full selves than they might usually think of when they're in a classroom setting. So I might say like when you think about calculus, like what do you think of? What are your associations? And just allowing those voices into the room, and those you get the preconceived notions about whatever you're about to teach, right? But you're also breaking the ice a bit, I think, in a way that allows people to really just share. So it's I love doing that on a small scale. Like essentially, you can break this down to just like small icebreaker exercises like that. And then as I was mentioning earlier, when I'm working with high school or college and graduate level in writing workshops, I'll often have storytelling exercises incorporated in the workshop. So it could be like for journalism, oftentimes, people can be incredible writers who, they might be able to write a 3,000 word essay that's like stunning, but their ability to pitch that essay, their ability to be able to sum up what it's about pretty concisely and clearly, that's a different skill entirely. So I'll often have people get up out of their seats, and then do this one-on-one share where they have to just in like 1 minute describe what a piece of their work is about, something they're working on or something they've already finished. And it's just flexing a different muscle. And so there's just ways to incorporate that storytelling into these different exercises that I think really just help the situation, get people's brains functioning in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. This is so this has already been fun to just pull some of these little exercises and ideas out. I mean, just, looking back over my notes, Micaela was talking about, listening to other people's stories, using small brainstorming. I'll just put them up on the screen. Building community, which was kind of tangential, and then applying storytelling principles to historical figures. I love that idea. That's great. And then, pitching a story concisely and clearly. Like those were some of the things that I was hearing. So let's take a little bit of time and let's just kind of jam on that for a second. Just kind of riff off of that idea of how might this show up in a variety of different kinds of classes, like all the way from Micaela's third grade class years ago to, like I taught high school Spanish. Of course, I use storytelling all the time to help students get practice with Spanish. So that's, it seems natural to me, in all different places. Like, let's just kind of play with that for a little bit and give the people that are watching some ideas of how they could bring it into their classes. What do you think?
Well, one of the other things that I'm thinking about too is like that storytelling is actually like one of the most amazing things that I've seen storytelling do in a classroom is shape the way people listen to each other. And I don't know that we've had a chance to talk about that much. But I feel like in terms of being able to support each other in a classroom setting, like obviously I come from a writing background. And so one of the key things when you're providing feedback is so often we're trained to project what we think is good onto someone else's work, right? So when we're giving feedback, the tendency I've seen at all ages, up into the, from elementary school to graduate level, is to respond to people sharing creative work, whatever it may be, in a way that's like, you should do this, or I think it would be better if you did this, even if they're not prefacing it with I think. It's like the presumption is this is objectively the better way to do this. And by creating a space of really active and radical listening, by shifting the autonomy to the person who's sharing their work, you're then changing that listening to this role of how can I support that person in achieving their goals, rather than how can I help them make it better. So a little more abstract, and I want to get into more specifics too, but I just feel like it's important to mention that the ways that listening is actually, I think, one of the most valuable components of integrating storytelling into a classroom. Yeah.
So I have a practical exercise that I love that relates to exactly what you're talking about, Onnesha, which is this. I think that telling a short story, often the biggest challenge is details, choosing details and knowing which details to include and which not to include. And I think that's across the board with writing as well, but there's some really fun ways that you can use storytelling to build that muscle that can then be applied to all kinds of other things, writing and things like that. And so one of the things that I often do with beginning workshops is this sort of 1 minute scene exercise. And we developed it back at the Moth and use it with high school students all the time. And I still use it with high school students, adults, the younger kids, it really works. So what you do is with everyone who is telling a story, who's working on something, or it could just be everyone, you don't have to be working on a story. They think of a place that means a lot to them, or that they have a certain opinion about or feeling about. And they have 1 minute on the clock. You set a timer. They have 1 minute to describe that place. You do not ask them to tell a story about that place. You just ask them to describe the place. And everyone else's job is to listen, and listen for what they see the most vividly. Listen for what picture is being created in their mind. Because one of the things that we don't know as ourselves as storytellers is what effect we're having on people. And so, related to what Onnesha is saying about making sure that we're centering what the listener wants to do this way, what the storyteller wants to do this way, so that the storyteller tells a minute-long description, and then people offer up, here's what I saw really vividly. I had this image of there was mist, even though you didn't mention mist. It seemed very foreboding and scary. I don't know why, right? And so they tell you the impression they had, and then you as the storyteller get to go, oh, it was not scary. It was actually very funny. I should probably figure out how I want to get that across. So it helps bridge that gap between this is how I feel about it and this is how it's coming across. But it's this very discrete moment that doesn't require a whole bunch of narrative. And that can also be fun because storytellers, beginning storytellers, and actually everyone, we often don't know what we do well or that we're doing it well. And hearing people reflect back to us what we've said in these ways and hearing the effects that we're having on people is actually very affirming and empowering.
It's kind of like the idea that you may be telling one story and the story that you see in your mind is one thing, but are you having that same effect in the minds of the listeners?
Exactly.
And is it different for different people, or is it universal across the board, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you get to hear that. You get one person saying it was super foreboding, one person saying, I just got this beautiful sense of calm from what you described. And you get to decide, okay, so that's how I'm coming across. How do I want to come across?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I've got another thing that I want to ask after this, but I want to tap this one till it's dry. Okay. So if we've got any other ideas of, ways that this could show up in the classroom, let's go ahead and keep running with those.
Morning meetings, in elementary school and middle school as well, maybe has morning meetings. I never taught middle school. I was always very scared of middle schoolers. I think that there's like that big divide for third grade teachers. But I think morning meetings are an amazing opportunity for small shares. And again, either using a timer and making it into a game, because I know that ages sort of like 6 through 9 sometimes don't necessarily have the sense of how much time they're taking with a story, and helping them figure that out, but also getting their voices out. I think this is something that a lot of teachers do. I think that elementary school teachers often understand personal narrative to be this into building community, but using structures and using listening and starting to develop that, like, and then you can get like 2 questions and a comment about what you heard. So that you start to build that awareness of listening and awareness of the storyteller being central.
Love that. Absolutely. Onnesha, what about you?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think about a lot is stories that we're not seeing, right? Being able to identify those. And so a great exercise that I've used in different contexts is like engaging with sort of canonical or formal texts. So say it's a high school history textbook, right? You have the students read this passage, about a particular event in history, and then you have them engage with this question of, okay, so in this summary of this event, who are we not hearing about? Yeah. Who are potentially the peripheral figures that we're not seeing discussed who might have been impacted by this, right? So like forcing students to sort of think about what's not here. And I've used that in writing workshops as well, for people who like to write about current events, or who are essayists who engage with what's going on, currently. And I'll have them, be reading the newspaper and doing the same kind of thing, engaging with like, who are the voices we may not be hearing from who might have been impacted by this thing that is being discussed. So I feel like that's a great way into building another part of perception and analysis.
Absolutely.
Oh, one more thing. Yes. And then another exercise that Micaela and I often use, which I feel like is great in terms of addressing that issue. Like so often when you work with folks of all ages in personal storytelling workshop context, it's like, oh, but I don't have like a really intense and impressive story. Nothing that interesting has happened to me. Or, I don't, I'm supposed to get really vulnerable and I don't know if I'm ready to do that. So to break that sort of ominous weight and sensibility of expectation, you can just do like I used to be, but now I am exercise. And, you can model that by saying like, I used to be a vegetarian, but now I sometimes eat meat, And so it can start off so basic. And when you engage people on that level, they're much more comfortable. They're like, oh, right, I can do this. I have a million examples of this. And then you just tack on after that, the next layer of that exercise is then, and this one time, right? So then you're locating a moment that will help you find, well, what instigated that shift? How did that change happen? Which like, that's the core of storytelling, right? Is being able to identify the change. So it's like a simple way in that hopefully lowers the stakes a little bit.
There's 2 that came to mind as well. And by the way, credit to I Used to Be, Now I Am is from Kenneth Koch's Rose, Where Did You Get That Red? Kenneth Koch's very old, very wonderful poetry for elementary school students. And I Used to Be, But Now I Am is a poetic form that he offers for young children to write as like a list poem. And so we just adapted it to be this story starter, which I always love that it comes from him because I really loved using him. 2 that came to mind. One is the one that Onnesha and I actually came up with somehow the first time we taught together. So the way that we met teaching this high school storytelling workshop together. And at this workshop, because of scheduling difficulties and all kinds of other things, it was a girls' school, and only 3 girls signed up for our team. So it was me, Onnesha, the faculty advisor, and 3 girls sitting in a room. And it was like not the party we wanted it to be, you know what I mean? And so as a result, it became such an amazing improvisational space. Like the students actually suggested to us that we tell stories as well in the show, because the show was going to be so short. So we all ended up telling stories. And then one of the exercises we did after we'd had some time to tell stories and to develop our stories, which really relates to that listening piece, someone would tell us their story. Someone would tell a version of their story, and then someone else would offer the design for either the movie or the movie preview that they could imagine. So who would they cast, and was it going to be a suspense movie? So I still remember there was one who told a story about a cruise, going on a cruise, and
yes.
we cast it as this sweeping epic romance. Like, we wanted a lot of orchestral music happening, and it just became such a fun, strange way to be engaging with one another's stories, which I don't know about you, but that happens to me in my head all the time. Like, I'm always going, oh, this is a telenovela, or, oh, whatever. And so that was a really fun one, and a really beautiful collaborative way to be building things inside of people's stories. And then I totally forgot the second one. I got too excited about that one.
That's a really good one, though. If it comes up at some point, you have, full permission to insert it awkwardly into a conversation about something else.
Perfect. Great.
Yeah. So while you're thinking about that, this was the one other question I wanted to get to, because, obviously this is the Soundtrap Education Summit. And I know a lot of educators that use Soundtrap use it for podcasting. And this is kind of a cool thing that is coming up within the education world, is that more and more teachers, because podcasting is becoming more and more accessible, are using podcasting within the classroom. And so I thought now might be a perfect time to talk about that beautiful combination of storytelling and podcasting. And so I thought maybe we could kind of riff on that just for a moment about, how that might, because, I think it's easy for teachers to say, oh, a student could go make a podcast if they want to, but I don't know how that's going to fit in my class. We've been kind of debunking that whole, I don't know how that fits in my class thing, like through this whole interview. So let's just keep it rolling. What do you think on that? Either of you?
The question, sorry, to be totally clear, Matt, the question is, what do we think about applying these things to podcasting in the classroom?
Yes.
Great. Do you have anything on Onnesha? I have a thought, but I wanted to see if you
go first. I'm still mulling.
Okay. So it's funny. One of the things that I love to do now, that I have been doing more and more, is working with podcast networks. So Adonde and Spoke and Business Insider and Marketplace and NPR as a story editor. And a story editor is essentially a storyteller for podcasts. So rather than I'm telling my story, I'm sitting with podcast producer teams, producers and hosts, and helping them make sure that the arc of what they're saying, the way that they're doing their podcast works. And so one of the things that I think has really helped me in that work, and it's amazing work, I love it, it's fascinating. It feels like being in a college class all the time, like an American Studies college class, especially because it's a lot of the ones that I'm working with are journalism and narrative journalism. But having these things of I used to be, but now I am, setting up the stakes of something, needing to understand context before you move on to the happenings of the story, all kinds of tools that we use when we're telling personal stories, the way that Onnesha and I teach it, become really applicable to taking a longer podcast episode, a 20-minute episode, and being able to identify what works, what do we need, what are we missing. And so actually, I think that they can work very beautifully together, that as you're working on storytelling, you can be applying some of those, especially that first question that Onnesha brought up, what makes a good story? That same question can be brought over to how do we build a podcast episode? Because and to make the process of making an episode. So the idea of editing a script, the idea of looking for where do we need music to either help raise us up or bring us out of a segment, all these kinds of pieces that you would talk about if you were producing a podcast, all have a lot to do with how are we moving a narrative forward, and what is the narrative that we're moving forward. So I think that they work really beautifully together, as well as, of course, making podcasts that are people's personal narratives and really understanding how we can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I should preface this by saying I didn't throw this out to them as one of the questions that we might talk about. So I'm really impressed that we're kind of pulling all of these ideas together on the fly. This is really impressive. So, Onnesha, did you have anything related to podcasting?
I do. My brain just went to this place. I don't know how useful this will be for other educators, but I'm literally just thinking about, this phenomenon of like very suspenseful serialized podcast seasons, like Serial itself, or, and I love the idea of marrying that like suspense and mystery to like a high school science class, where it's like, like this potato subjected to different conditions, like what will grow? Like each episode is like, featuring student voices. And I feel like they're like students could have so much fun with that, like bringing that playful energy of suspense, of like tune in, next episode to find out what happens with the potato. And like you've got your hypothesis and it's like, well, what do you think, Dan? Like, do you think, and then, I don't know. I love the idea of marrying that together. I feel like students could have so much fun with like the different expectations and voices and subverting those. And it also just enables them to engage with like their authentic selves a little bit more, bring a little of themselves more to the table with things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I also, while you were bringing that up, first of all, I really want to know what happened to the potato. But also, I feel like the other piece of what podcasting can offer in terms of storytelling is related to this question of like boundaries and the authority and the central power of the storyteller, him or her or their self. That a podcast, so choosing your audience is a huge part of being able to understand where do I want to share this story? What is the story I want to share? Where do I want to share it? I'm in control of every layer of that, ideally, right? That there's no moment when I'm told for a grade, I need to get up in an assembly and share my personal experience. That would be not good. So a podcast offers us this opportunity to first of all, decide how we want it to come out and decide which parts we want to use and edit out the pieces that we don't, or add in the pieces that we feel are important context, and also becomes a way that we get to be in control of audience in a different and new way. So if I want to hear it and make sure I feel good about it before I hand it out into the world, that's what a podcast has to offer us versus live storytelling. So one of the things that we often recommend to educators who are doing live storytelling in their classroom is to allow each student to choose their audience. Do they want to share with the whole class? Do they want to share with a trusted small group? Do they want to share just with me at lunch, right? That everyone has control over that. And podcasting feels like an additional layer of control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and just listening to you talk about that, Micaela, like the notion that as the podcaster, like as if a student is the host, it's like centering their voice and their perspective in a really powerful way. And just to acknowledge that when we're thinking about oral storytelling, and that is that is a tradition that is incredibly strong, right? But not one that we emphasize in a lot of school curriculums. So podcasting actually also offers up this this opportunity to center oral storytelling, whether it's a student who's interviewing family members or other people, and bringing that to the table as a way of engaging with the curriculum. That's potentially a really powerful thing to allow students that option to respond to assignments and to engage with the material with this oral storytelling and historical perspective.
Yeah. Oh, this has been great. I have two more questions. And see, we're running out of time. I totally know that we're running out of time, but we have two. I have two questions that I'm dying to ask you, and so we're going to try to squeeze both of them in. Okay.
We'll try to be brief. I know we're very chatty, so we'll try to be.
It's been fantastic, though. It's no complaints here. So the one that I don't know if you're going to be able to be brief in, but I hope that you can be brief in, has to do with something we were talking about before we came on air that I found in my homework before we started on here. And that is the idea of something called PowerPoint roulette. I have no idea what this is. We just kind of mentioned it in passing. And I said, oh, I ought to bring this up. I've just been thinking about that through this entire interview. And I'm really, really dying to know what PowerPoint roulette is, because it sounds like a lot of fun.
It is a whole lot of fun. So it's a show that was co-founded by a friend of mine, Darren Solomon, who's a very talented musician. But he runs this. It's basically an improv show. And the conceit is that really foolish, susceptible people like Micaela and I will volunteer to go on stage. And then we have not seen this beforehand, but he has pulled together a mashup of publicly available PowerPoint slides. Like, it's just a total mix, like whatever, whether it's like a corporate conference, like, a PowerPoint from a TED Talk, but like just
a 10-year-old, there's a 10-year-old who wants to convince his parents that he should get a motorbike, and he's made a PowerPoint presentation, and that's publicly available on this website. So like, he's pulled a slide of that.
Yeah. So you have no idea what you're going to be seeing. You get up on stage, and then and you're like, hello, welcome to my, our talk about, and then cue the slides. So the slides just pop up, and then you just in real time have to respond to whatever is behind you and try to make some sort of story from it, right? Like, it's total mishmash, each slide from, one to the next. So yeah, so Micaela and I were co-presenters. I think the first slide was cosplay 101, and we were like, exactly, oh yeah, right. Yes, of course.
Yeah. And we built in our brains as we were up there this sort of very long and venerable like career that we had as costumers for cosplayers, and that there was some real tension between us about certain things.
Yes, the tension emerged.
The tension emerged over the course of the PowerPoint. But what's really fun about it, and something that I do naturally to my detriment, I should not do this as much as I do, but I always accidentally sound very authoritative, as though I know what I'm talking about, even when I have no idea what I'm talking about. And it gets me in trouble, actually. So someone will be like, oh, is it going to rain tonight? I'll say, there's a 70% chance. I have no idea. Why did I say that? That's not something I should have said. And I'll often just say right afterwards, I have no idea. But this got us into, it kind of fed into the way that we're friends anyway, which is this sort of like constantly doing sketch comedy a little bit. But after this, so I have to share, because I think that it is very actionable for a lot of people who might be watching. I had a really good friend who watched our PowerPoint roulette, who loved it. He then went on vacation with his family and called me after his vacation and said, we did PowerPoint roulette. Like, my whole family did PowerPoint roulette. Everyone was responsible for making someone else's presentation. So only one person had seen your presentation. So the family didn't know what it was, and there was no one person in charge. And then people had to get up in the living room and do a PowerPoint presentation that was, 6 minutes or less or whatever. And he said it was the most fun his family had ever had. And I think that there's something really lovely, like, advisory about that idea that's very goofy, and there's a built-in, I don't know about this, so there's no pressure to know about it kind of thing.
Yeah, now that we're talking about this, I'm thinking about how excellent this would be in a more formal space like a classroom, right? Because what it's doing is like evening the playing field. Like, no one expects anyone to go up there and actually sound competent, because the whole conceit of the game is that you will fail, and we are all going to enjoy it when we collectively fail and make fools of ourselves. Like, it like opens up the space of play, while at the same time, like the playfulness is making fun of authority a little bit, it's like, which I think just allows in this level of humility that I think is so valuable, and like, of course I was nervous up there on stage, but at the same time, I recognized that, like, me saying dumb stuff was exactly what the audience wanted, like, it was like we were all together in that experience.
And I think that the two of us doing it together, which they hadn't had two people doing it together before, I felt like we were cheating because we could depend on each other. And it makes me think that in a classroom setting, doing it as a team is a lot less of like, okay, get up there, hope you're funny, right? Which is a little bit of the danger. And if you have like 3 people up there, then someone can step in and go, oh yeah, I can take this slide, right? And sort of take that.
And then you can develop, then there's like that additional, like we were talking about, layer of like the playful dynamic that you develop as these characters with each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Oh my goodness. That was okay. That was everything I hoped
We
that
should
it
do
would
more
be.
of
That's
that.
fantastic.
We
Yeah.
should.
Oh, that's
Do that
good. That's
again.
good.
Yeah, I mean, both of
Okay.
us have backgrounds in comedy and improv too. So I mean, that plays
Yeah.
into there. You know, there's a common thread here for sure, which
And
is
see,
engaging
this
with narrative and yeah.
this is fantastic too, because we've got an actual session dedicated to improv and how that can be incorporated in the classroom and all of that.
Nice.
And so yeah, all good stuff. So here's the last thing. This is what, and again, we're just gonna be over, and I don't care. So this is the question that we're ending all of our sessions with. And so I'd love to hear your short answer, as short as possible. And the question is, what can we do to help students use their voices to change the world? Because in many ways we are, that's really what we've been talking about through this entire time. So I know that's kind of a deep question, but if somebody put you on the spot, because somebody is putting you on the spot, what's your answer to that? Who wants to take that first?
Oh, I'll go first.
Is she doing that on purpose?
Yes. I'm assuming.
Are you sure that she's doing it on purpose?
No, totally.
Yeah.
I
don't think she was. Okay, to clue in those of you that are watching, we joked before the recording started. See the laughter over here? Here's what's going on. Beforehand, we were talking about how hilarious it is that whenever Micaela wants to answer something, but she doesn't want to answer it, she'll act like her microphone is off and she'll start doing this. And it kind of gives her some time to think. And now it's actually happening and she didn't even realize it. And I think her microphone is still on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Oh, that's hilarious. I didn't plan that even a little bit. That was amazing.
I was like, wow, she's really committing to this joke.
Yes, she was.
Well, what I was saying, and I didn't realize you couldn't hear me, was my AirPods ran out, and I apologize if the quality of my voice has changed.
We can still hear you. Yeah.
Okay, you can still hear me. That's real funny, because I think when I took the AirPods out, the mute button turned on, and then it went to like some other. I had to like go into my settings. Whatever. Anyway, wow, cool.
Yeah. Okay. Oh my goodness. Okay, go ahead, Onnesha.
Yes. So the question, what can we do to help students use their voices to change the world? So yes. I'm intrigued by that question. As a pain in the ass and a writer, I see that question and I'm like, well, but it's all about allowing them, like creating space for them to cultivate their voices and understand that their voices are powerful, right? And that their perspectives are incredibly powerful. So to me, the reason that I love storytelling so much is that, especially in the high school or undergraduate space, is that I feel like those are these key moments when students are trying to figure out who they are in the world. And I feel like if you can build in spaces during those pivotal times in their lives in which they have space to really reckon with how they construct their own identities. And, like that thing we were discussing earlier of radical listening, if you are creating spaces where you set it up so that the people they're surrounded by, they feel as though they are there to support them in their own journey on their own terms, like that to me is the power of storytelling and identity. And I think if you have especially marginalized people who have a stronger sense of the value of their voices and are able to better construct their identities based on their own parameters and values and ideas about themselves, then like that inherently will enable them to change the world in incredible ways.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
I love that. I think that's so, yes. And also one of the things that I've been thinking so much about in the last year and a half or so is the idea that in learning how to tell stories or practicing telling stories, making space to tell stories, we are not only becoming better storytellers, we are becoming better story listeners. And that listening is transferable. that we're not just teaching people how to listen in a circle to a story that's being told. We're also making space for people to realize that when they hear anybody, anywhere, they can think about, what are the stakes for this person? What is the context for this person? How has this person changed, and how does this person want to change? How can I see them in a way that's going to connect us? And so I actually think in how can we help students better use their voices to change the world, we can also help them use their ears, I guess, to change the world as well, to understand that they are part of, right? I think that there's something about personal narrative and personal storytelling that makes us want to think we are individuals. And that part of what I hear in you saying, Onnesha, and part of what I believe very strongly is that any personal story is inside of a social, political, economic, individual context, right? Like we are all who we are at every moment, whatever the story it is that we're telling. And so to help students see themselves in that context, to help them place themselves, understand where they want to be, where they are not by choice, where they're being told to be, and then also how they can use this radical listening that we've been talking about outside of the story circle, outside of these pieces, to really understand where everyone else is placed all the time. That storytelling really becomes a frame for understanding identity with authenticity and empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I love all of that. And of course, after I feel like I rambled so much in my response, and as soon as I stopped talking, I was like, the more concise way to say what I was just saying is, I would really love to create spaces in classrooms that shifts the onus away from students feeling like they're thinking, what should I say? What am I supposed to say in response to this? To what do I want to say? What do I need to say?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I just want to sit with that for a second. Instead of what should I say? What am I supposed to say? It's what do I want to say and what do I need to say? And it seems like, we're in a world right now where we need people, especially kids growing up into the next generation that they will be in. We need people who are bold enough to step up and say, what do I need to say? What do I want to say in this context? And to have the voice to be able to do it.
Yeah. And I think as educators, it's our responsibility to make sure we're doing that. We're creating those spaces for students.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great point for us to finish this. So I have adored this conversation. This has been fantastic. Let's do the real quick. If people want to find more about you, if they want to connect, if they want to just see more, where's the best place for them to go? Micaela, you start.
My website, it's MicaelaBlei. My name is right there. .com, and you can see stories I tell. You can read a little bit more about the work that I do. You can get in touch, and you can find all the places to follow me there.
Excellent. Onnesha?
Yeah, so my website is my first name, onnesha.com.
I'm so jealous of that.
Yes, I have a highly Googleable name, which is both good and bad. And then if you follow me on Facebook, you'll get my periodic political ramblings. And then, if you want to buy my book, it's got a lot of my ideas in practice, which is called The Marginalized Majority, Claiming Our Power in a Post-Truth America.
Marginalized Majority. Excellent. Just trying to get that typed out real quick before we wrap up. So, oh my goodness, this has been fantastic. And we went a little over an hour, and I said 45 minutes plus or minus, and here we are way over an hour. But I think if you're still watching this at this point, you're like me, that you've really, really appreciated, the thoughtfulness and the practical ideas and really the inspiration that has come from all of this. And that all came thanks to Micaela and Onnesha. Thank you both so much for being a part of this.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the great question.
Absolutely.
It's such a pleasure to get to gab storytelling with two smart people.
Well, hey, I think it was enjoyable for everybody. So, and I want to thank you for watching the video, also for being a part of the Soundtrap Education Summit, and we'll see you on the next video. Take care.